The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile conference room of the downtown police precinct. Officer Julia Myers sat rigidly in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. The morning sun streamed through the grimy windows, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the three senior officers seated across from her like a tribunal of judgment. Captain Rodriguez, a man in his 50s with graying temples and hard eyes, leaned forward with deliberate slowness. His voice was measured, cold, carrying the weight of authority and disappointment. Officer Myers, what you did yesterday wasn't just reckless. It was a complete abandonment of protocol. You endangered civilians, you endangered your partner, and you endangered yourself. Julia's jaw tightened. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to explain that sometimes the right thing to do isn't found in any manual or procedure. But the words stuck in her throat like stones. These men had already made their decision. She could see it in their faces, in the way they avoided her eyes, in the finality of their posture. Lieutenant Harrison, younger but no less stern, shuffled through a stack of papers. The incident report shows you pursued a suspect into a construction zone without backup, without clearance, and without regard for civilian safety. 3 people could have been seriously injured. But they weren't, Julia finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The suspect was apprehended, no one was hurt, and that's not the point, Captain Rodriguez cut her off sharply. The point is that you went rogue. You decided that your judgment was more important than the procedures we've established to keep everyone safe. That kind of cowboy mentality has no place in this department. The third officer, Sergeant Williams, a woman with steel gray hair and tired eyes, spoke for the first time. Julia, you're a good officer. Your record shows dedication, courage, and a genuine desire to serve. But this incident, it's not the first time you've pushed boundaries. The department can't continue to overlook a pattern of behavior that puts everyone at risk. Julia felt the walls closing in around her. 9 years of service, 9 years of putting her life on the line, of working double shifts, of being the first to volunteer for the dangerous assignments. None of it mattered now. One moment of following her instincts instead of the rule book, and everything she'd worked for was crumbling. Outside the precinct, the city was waking up. Traffic hummed past on the busy street. People hurried to work with coffee cups in hand. Life continued its relentless pace. But inside this room, time seemed suspended, heavy with the weight of consequence. Meanwhile, several blocks away, an older man named Thomas Brennan sat in his small apartment, staring at a weathered cardboard box on his kitchen table. The box was marked in faded black ink, J. Myers, 2014. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it, not from age, but from the emotion that always overwhelmed him when he thought about what was inside. Thomas was 64 years old, a retired mechanic with calloused hands and a gentle spirit. His gray hair was thinning, his face lined with the years, but his eyes still held the clarity of someone who remembered every detail of the most important day of his life. He had carried this box with him through 3 apartment moves, always keeping it close, always knowing that someday he might need what was inside. He opened the box carefully, as if handling something sacred. Inside were newspaper clippings, printed emails, photographs, and a letter written in the careful handwriting of someone who had been given a second chance at life. At the bottom of the box, lay a small digital recorder, the kind used by reporters, and a manila envelope sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. Thomas picked up the top newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local Teen Rescued from Bridge." The article was brief, clinical in its description of events. It mentioned that a 17-year-old girl had been talked down from the Riverside Bridge by an unnamed police officer after a 3-hour standoff. The girl's name was protected, listed only as Sarah B. But Thomas knew that Sarah B. was his daughter, and he knew exactly who that unnamed officer was. He stood up slowly, his joints protesting after sitting for so long. The morning air was crisp as he stepped on outside, the box tucked securely under his arm. He had watched the news the night before, had seen the report about Officer Julia Myers being called in for a disciplinary hearing. Something about a pursuit that had gone wrong, about protocol violations and potential suspension. He had recognized her name immediately, had spent the night unable to sleep, knowing what he had to do. The walk to the precinct took him 20 minutes. With each step, he thought about that day 9 years ago, about the phone call that had changed everything. Sarah had been struggling with depression, had been fighting battles that Thomas hadn't fully understood. When the call came that she was on the bridge threatening to jump, his world had collapsed. He had raced to the scene, had stood behind the police barricades with tears streaming down his face, watching as his daughter teetered on the edge of life and death. Back in the conference room, the atmosphere had grown even more tense. Captain Rodriguez was reading from a prepared statement, his voice monotone and official. Given the severity of the violations and the pattern of behavior, we are recommending immediate suspension pending a full internal investigation. Your badge and weapon will be confiscated, and you will be placed on administrative leave without pay. Julia felt the blood drain from her face. Without pay meant she wouldn't be able to make rent, wouldn't be able to support herself while fighting to clear her name. It meant that her career, her calling, her entire identity was being stripped away because she had chosen to trust her instincts over a manual. Furthermore, Lieutenant Harrison continued, any future employment in law enforcement will require disclosure of this incident. We're sorry it's come to this, Julia, but the department cannot. The door to the conference room opened with a soft click. All heads turned to see a security guard peering in nervously. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a gentleman here who says he has information relevant to Officer Myers' case. He's been waiting outside for over an hour. Captain Rodriguez looked annoyed. We're in the middle of a disciplinary hearing. He can make an appointment with... Please, came a voice from behind the security guard. Thomas Brennan stepped into view, still holding his box. I think you need to see this. It's about Officer Myers. The three senior officers exchanged glances. There was something in the old man's demeanor, a quiet dignity and determination that gave them pause. Captain Rodriguez gestured to a chair. You have 5 minutes. Thomas walked slowly to the table, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent room. He set the box down gently, and Julia noticed that his hands were steady now, as if he had found his purpose. He looked directly at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she couldn't quite identify. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition. My name is Thomas Brennan, he began, his voice clear and strong despite his age. 9 years ago, my daughter Sarah was in a very dark place. She was 17, struggling with depression, and had gotten to the point where she felt she had no other choice but to end her life. The room remained silent, all eyes fixed on the old man as he carefully opened the box. On March 15, 2014, Sarah climbed over the railing of the Riverside Bridge. She was going to jump. The police were called, and they set up a perimeter, but for 3 hours, no one could get through to her. She wouldn't talk to the crisis negotiators, wouldn't respond to the chaplain, wouldn't even look at me when I begged her to come down. Thomas removed the first item from the box, a newspaper clipping. Then Officer Myers arrived. She wasn't even supposed to be there. She was off duty, had heard the call on her radio, and came anyway. She didn't ask permission, didn't wait for orders. She just walked out onto that bridge. Julia's eyes widened. She remembered that day, remembered the desperate father, the scared girl, the way the wind had whipped across the bridge, making every word a struggle. She had acted on instinct then, too, had ignored the incident commander's orders to stay back, had walked out onto the bridge because she had sensed that Sarah needed something different than what the trained negotiators were offering. What happened next isn't in any official report, Thomas continued, reaching into the box again. Officer Myers didn't try to talk Sarah down with psychology or procedure. She just stood there, about 10 feet away, and started talking about her own life, about her own struggles, about times when she had felt hopeless, about the small things that had kept her going. He pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the table. Sarah was wearing a wire, not for the police, but because she had been recording voice messages for me, for her mother, for her younger brother. She wanted us to know that we weren't the reason she was doing this. But the recorder kept running, and it captured everything Officer Myers said. Thomas pressed play, and Julia's voice from 9 years ago filled the room. It was younger, less weathered, but unmistakably hers. I know it feels like the whole world is against you right now. I know it feels like the pain will never stop. But I also know that tomorrow is going to be different from today, and the day after that is going to be different from tomorrow. You don't have to carry all of this alone. The recording continued for several minutes. Julia's voice was patient, gentle, completely unlike the authoritative tone she used in her police work. She spoke about her own struggles with anxiety, about the time she had considered leaving the force, about the small victories that had kept her going. She talked about the sunrise she had seen that morning, about the coffee that had tasted particularly good, about the way her neighbor's dog always wagged its tail when it saw her. She stood there for 45 minutes, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, just talking. Not trying to convince Sarah to come down, not making promises about how great life would be, just sharing her own humanity. The recording ended with the sound of footsteps, of Sarah finally, slowly, climbing back over the railing. There were no dramatic words, no moment of revelation, just a scared girl deciding that maybe, just maybe, she could try for one more day. Thomas reached into the box again and pulled out a sealed envelope. This is a letter Sarah wrote to Officer Myers 2 years later. She wanted to thank her, wanted to tell her what her words had meant. But when she tried to find her, she was told that the department couldn't give out personal information about officers. He opened the envelope carefully and began to read. Dear Officer Myers, you probably don't remember me, but you saved my life on the Riverside Bridge in March of 2014. I want you to know that I'm okay now. I'm in college, studying psychology, because I want to help people the way you helped me. I think about what you said that day all the time, about how tomorrow is different from today. You were right. Tomorrow was different, and the day after that was different too. I'm writing this letter to tell you that I'm happy. I'm happy, and I'm alive. And it's because of you." Sergeant Williams had tears in her eyes. Lieutenant Harrison was staring at the table, his jaw clenched. Captain Rodriguez was looking at Julia with an expression she had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but something approaching awe. Thomas wasn't finished. He reached into the box once more and pulled out a series of photographs. "These are pictures from Sarah's graduation from high school, from her starting college, from her wedding last year. She's a licensed therapist now, working with teenagers who are struggling with the same issues she faced. She's helped dozens of young people find their way back from dark places." He set the photographs on the table in front of the three officers. "She's also the mother of my granddaughter, who was born 6 months ago. A little girl who exists because Officer Myers chose to break protocol, chose to ignore orders, chose to trust her instincts about what was right." The room was completely silent now. Julia was struggling to breathe, overwhelmed by the weight of what she was hearing. She had never known what happened to Sarah after that day. She had written her report, had been reprimanded for leaving her assigned patrol area, and had tried to put the incident behind her. She had never imagined that her words, her presence, her decision to act on instinct had rippled forward through the years in ways she could never have foreseen. Thomas pulled out the final item from the box, a body cam photo that had been taken by another officer who had arrived at the scene. It showed Julia standing on the bridge, her back to the camera, facing Sarah. There was something in her posture, in the way she held herself, that spoke of infinite patience, of someone willing to stand there for as long as it took. Officer Myers never filed a report about what she actually did that day, Thomas said. Her official incident report just says that she assisted in talking down a potential suicide victim. It doesn't mention the 45 minutes she spent sharing her own struggles. Doesn't mention the way she connected with my daughter as a human being, not as a police officer. It doesn't mention that she visited Sarah in the hospital later that night, on her own time, to check on her. He looked directly at Julia. She never told anyone what she had done, never sought recognition, never tried to use it to advance her career. She just went back to work the next day and continued serving the community. Captain Rodriguez picked up the body cam photo, studying it carefully. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "Officer Myers, why didn't you tell us about this?" Julia looked down at her hands, her voice barely audible. "It was just my job. Sarah needed help, and I was there. That's what we do." "No," Thomas said firmly. "That's not what you do. That's what you did. You went beyond your job, beyond your training, beyond your orders. You gave a piece of yourself to save my daughter's life, and you never asked for anything in return." Lieutenant Harrison was reading through the other documents in the box. Commendations from Sarah's college professors. Thank you notes from other families Sarah had helped. A letter from the mayor's office acknowledging Sarah's work with at-risk youth. All of this, it all traces back to that day on the bridge. Every single bit of it, Thomas confirmed. My daughter's life, her education, her career, her family, the people she's helped, none of it would exist if Officer Myers had followed protocol that day. If she had stayed in her assigned area, if she had waited for orders, if she had let the trained negotiators handle the situation. Sergeant Williams spoke up, her voice thoughtful. But the incident yesterday, pursuing the suspect into the construction zone, that was different. That was the same thing, Thomas interrupted. It was the same instinct, the same willingness to put herself at risk to protect others. I saw the news report. The suspect had a weapon, was threatening construction workers. Officer Myers saw people in danger and acted to protect them, just like she acted to protect my daughter. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I did some research last night. Do you know how many commendations Officer Myers has received in her 9 years of service? 12. Do you know how many times she's been disciplined for protocol violations? 7. Do you know what the connection is between those two numbers? The three officers waited for him to continue. Every single commendation came as a result of her breaking protocol to help someone. Every single discipline came from the same actions that earned her recognition. She's being punished for being exactly the kind of officer we need more of. Captain Rodriguez set down the photo and looked at Julia with new eyes. Officer Myers, I need to ask you something directly. Yesterday, when you pursued that suspect into the construction zone, what were you thinking? Julia took a deep breath. I was thinking about the 3 workers who were trapped on the scaffolding. The suspect was waving a gun around, screaming that he was going to shoot anyone who tried to stop him. I saw those workers, saw the fear in their eyes, and I couldn't just wait for backup. I couldn't follow protocol while people were in immediate danger. And the outcome? The suspect was apprehended without anyone getting hurt. The workers were safe. My partner arrived 30 seconds later and provided backup. The situation was resolved. Lieutenant Harrison leaned back in his chair. So you're telling us that your decision to ignore protocol resulted in a successful outcome with no injuries? Yes, sir. Thomas stood up slowly. Gentlemen, I'm not a police officer. I don't know anything about procedures or protocols, but I know that 9 years ago, my daughter was about to die, and Officer Myers saved her life by trusting her instincts instead of following rules. And I know that yesterday, 3 construction workers went home safe to their families because she made the same choice. He began packing the items back into the box. I brought these things here because I thought you should know who Officer Myers really is. Not just the officer who breaks protocol, but the officer who saves lives. Not just the officer who ignores orders, but the officer who puts herself at risk to protect others. Captain Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, studying the document spread across the table. Finally, he spoke. Officer Myers, these disciplinary proceedings are hereby suspended pending a full review of your case. Your badge and weapon will be returned to you, and you will report for duty tomorrow morning. Julia looked up in shock. Sir? Furthermore, he continued, I'm recommending you for the Department's Medal of Valor for your actions yesterday. And I'm also recommending that we review our protocols to ensure that officers have the flexibility to make judgment calls in situations that require immediate action. Sergeant Williams nodded in agreement. Sometimes the rulebook isn't enough. Sometimes we need officers who are willing to think beyond the manual, who are willing to risk their careers to do what's right. Thomas smiled as he lifted the box from the table. Officer Myers, I have one more thing to give you. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a recent photograph. This is Sarah with her daughter, Emma. Sarah wanted you to have this. She wanted you to know that every time she looks at her daughter, she thinks about the woman who gave her the chance to become a mother. Julia took the photograph with shaking hands. In it, a young woman with bright eyes and a genuine smile was holding a baby. The woman looked happy, confident, alive. It was impossible to reconcile this image with the desperate teenager on the bridge 9 years ago. She also wanted me to tell you something, Thomas continued. She said that you taught her that being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means being afraid and choosing to act anyway. She said that lesson has guided her through every difficult moment in her life since that day. As Thomas walked toward the door, he paused and turned back. Officer Myers, I want you to know that you didn't just save my daughter's life that day. You saved our entire family. You gave us back our future. And now, every life that Sarah touches in her work, every person she helps, every family she keeps together, that's part of your legacy too. The door closed behind him, leaving the 4 officers in stunned silence. Julia stared at the photograph, at the tangible proof that her instincts, her willingness to break protocol, had created ripples that extended far beyond anything she had imagined. Captain Rodriguez cleared his throat. Officer Myers, I owe you an apology. We all do. We were so focused on the rules that we forgot why those rules exist in the first place. To protect people, to serve the community, to make a difference in people's lives. Lieutenant Harrison nodded. Your actions yesterday and 9 years ago exemplify everything we should be striving for in this department. You didn't just enforce the law, you served humanity. As Julia left the precinct that morning, her badge restored and her faith in her calling renewed, she carried with her the photograph of Sarah and Emma. She thought about the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the badge, about the moments when protocol and instinct collided, about the choice to act with courage even when the consequences were uncertain. She had learned that sometimes the most important decisions couldn't be found in any manual, that sometimes serving others required the willingness to risk everything, including your career. Most importantly, she had learned that the choices we make in moments of crisis don't just affect the immediate situation, they ripple forward through time, touching lives in ways we may never fully understand. The morning sun was now high in the sky, and the city continued its relentless pace. But for Julia Myers, everything had changed. She was no longer just an officer who broke protocol. She was an officer who understood that sometimes breaking the rules was the most important part of the job. As she walked back to her patrol car, she thought about the 3 construction workers who had gone home safely the night before, about Sarah and her daughter Emma, about all the lives that had been touched by moments of courage and compassion. She thought about the badge she wore, not just as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of the responsibility to serve others, even when it meant putting herself at risk. And she knew that the next time she faced a choice between protocol and instinct, between following orders and following her conscience, she would choose to act with the same courage that had defined her career. The courage to be human in a world that often demanded otherwise.